Hi guys, John here from THKP, and this is part 2 in my app state management series. Enjoy! Alright, I've gone ahead and reverted all the way back to where we started before we implemented any app state management. This next pattern is going to be using an inherited model, which is just a built-in class in Flutter, so you don't need to add any additional libraries, which is kind of nice. So let's define our model. We'll just call it app state for now. This will extend inherited model. Inherited model has a few methods that you have to define. You also should define what your model type is, which is this type parameter right now. And for now, I'm just going to create a fruit type enumeration, apples, oranges. So my inherited model will be of type fruit type. And then in these methods, you can actually just replace this value right here with your actual class, which I like to do. And this set right here will be a set fruit type. So this update should notify is available in any inherited widget. And the way this method should work is you just need to check if your widget changed. So let's add some state here. This all has to be final because this is an immutable widget. So I'll say apple count, final int orange count. Let's add a constructor for those two fields. So now in this method, we can just return apple count not equal to the current apple count, or the old orange count is not equal to the current orange count. This method is kind of where the magic happens. So inside this method, what you can do is only update a dependent, or I should say only notify a dependent if that dependent depends on a particular fruit type. So this method is called when a widget is wondering whether it should update. And if that widget knows which fruit it cares about, it will pass the fruit into this method. And we'll show you how that works in just a minute, but for now, let's implement this method. So what we can say is if the dependencies contains fruit type of apples and the apples have changed. So old widget apple count is not equal to the current apple count. Then return true. If the dependencies contains a fruit type of orange and the orange count has changed, then return true. Otherwise, we don't have to update because none of the dependencies that we actually care about have changed. So we have our state all defined nicely, and we have this mechanism set up so that we should only notify when a particular type of state changes. But we have one problem. This state is final. We have no way of updating a final parameter, and it has to be final. So if I delete this, we get this error, it's a warning, but this class inherits from is marked immutable. So this inherited model is part of an immutable hierarchy. So let's obey that. We'll keep it final. What we need to do in order to make this class work properly is wrap it in another class which owns the actual state. So we'll call this app state wrapper, and this will just simply be a stateful widget. The way this class works is it just simply returns an app state with the two current values And it will also return a child of the app itself. So let's add this child parameter. Let's also just update this class. I actually prefer this type of constructor. So any inherited widget is going to have an optional child parameter in its superclass, and this will just be the hierarchy where this inherited widget is available. So in here we'll say apple count is equal to apple count, orange count is equal to orange count. Apple orange, nice. And the child is going to be the app itself. So let's provide some sort of methods for updating these two states. I'm going to do something similar to what I did last time. Let's just say increment apples. So now whenever these two methods are invoked, this class will rebuild, and the app state will be populated with the new values, apple count and orange count. But we have one other issue here. How do we actually call these functions? What we want to be able to do is access our state anywhere in the app and simply invoke these functions. So what I like to do is just make these functions available in the state itself. And that's fairly easy to do. You can just create a final void function called increment apples to add these two functions. Okay, so we pass these two functions into our state, which means that anyone who has access to our state can invoke these two functions. It will call these two methods. It will return a whole new app state with the right counts, and it will rebuild the app. So now, how do we get these state values when we're inside of our app? Let's take a look at how that works. So once again, we need our counts inside this widget right here, also inside this widget, and inside this widget. So let's do it just for apples. Now here's where you can say inherited model, inherit from context with an aspect, and we only care about apples here. And you can also provide a type here, just in order to give it a little hint as to which state to look up. Okay, and then in our state, we can just simply say apple count. This errored because we haven't actually initialized our app with our state. So let's see how to do that. That's gonna happen back in our main function. So let's go to main, and we just simply have to wrap our app in our app state wrapper. Child is going to be our app. Let's make sure we have our child parameter. All right, and then instead of creating a new app every time, let's just say widget.child. Okay, that looks good. Let's rebuild our app. All right, now let's update our Apple button widget. We have to do the same thing. So inherited model, inherit from context with an aspect of apples. And once again, we'll provide the type. Alright, so then as mentioned earlier, we have those two functions, increment apples. We can just call that right in here. All right, very cool. So now our state is properly being passed around the app. Let's go ahead and verify that we are not unnecessarily creating stuff. So let's clear our console. All right, so we are only updating the correct widgets. Let's do the same thing for our oranges. We have to remember to provide the correct fruit type here. All right, and let's finally modify this widget right here. Now this widget needs to rebuild no matter what state gets updated. So unfortunately, this inherit from method only takes one aspect. So I'm actually going to call it twice just to notify that if any of these aspects changes, we need to change our state. So the first time, I'll just simply not set anything, and the second time I'll actually set our state, and this is just going to be apple count, orange count. Let's clear our console. All right, so good. We can see that only the widgets that we care about are updating. This widget is reflecting the correct value. So I do want to show you what happens if I don't add this call, because this looks like a totally unnecessary call. So you can see that I'm only updating if oranges changes. So you can see I'm not rebuilding our winning fruit indicator, which is actually a problem. So if I go to there are currently more oranges, it does not properly update. So I need that other call, even though it looks completely unnecessary. Okay, so that's a quick implementation of the inherited model approach. Just like to give my quick thoughts on this. Firstly, it's cool that we don't have to import some new library. This is all just basic out-of-box Flutter. It uses all of Flutter's widget library, inherited models, inherited widgets, which I think are a good thing to get used to and use in your app. However, I do have a few problems with this approach. First is just this ugly additional call that you have to make if you depend on multiple pieces of the model. Now, I should say that since we only have 2 pieces of model, we could just change the code to not include an aspect, and that would actually work as we expect, because if you don't include an aspect, it will just get the most up-to-date model every time. However, if we have a bunch of pieces of model, which is usually the case, and we only depend on a few of them, then I think you have to make these weird, seemingly unnecessary calls to inherit from. One other thing I don't like about this is that you need this wrapper object. It's a lot of boilerplate, and it's also just a little bit confusing in my opinion. Also, in order to update your state properly, I think you need to implement some sort of mechanism like this. Otherwise, you might need to do change notifications, sort of like the previous approach, and then it just starts to feel somewhat magical. And speaking of magic, this business, where just by calling this method, you might cause your widget to rebuild. This feels much more magical to me than the consumer approach. I think this method is easy to accidentally call, like say in your apples and oranges class, you think you might need this state. Now, every time I update my oranges, I'm essentially rebuilding my entire app just because I added this one line here. It doesn't necessarily look that serious, but I'm actually causing my entire app to rebuild. So I think there are some foot guns here. Now, obviously, if you know what you're doing, you can avoid all of those issues. And in some ways, I do like this approach, but just be aware of those things and you should be okay. Alright, that's the inherited model pattern. Very useful pattern as long as you're aware of a few small quirks. In the next video, I'll be covering my personal favorite pattern, so stick around. Bye-bye.